I wish someone had grabbed me by the shoulders at 25, looked me straight in the eyes and said this clearly. You are not late, you are not broken, you are not running out of time, but you are wasting it without realizing how fast. It disappears. At that age, I believed life would somehow slow down, that clarity would arrive one morning like a switch flipping on. I thought confidence came before action, and certainty came before commitment. No one warned me that waiting quietly steals more dreams than failure ever could. At 25, I lived with constant pressure and constant comparison. I watched other people's highlight reels and assumed they were ahead while I was falling behind. I believed there was a correct timeline for success, love, and happiness, and I felt like I had already missed several invisible deadlines. What I didn't understand then is that most people my age were just as confused, only better at hiding it. Confusion is not a weakness at 25. It is proof that you are aware enough to question your direction. If I had known this earlier, I would have stopped punishing myself for not having everything figured out. I also chased approval like it was oxygen. I said yes when I wanted to say no. I stayed quiet when something felt wrong. I shaped my personality to fit rooms I should have walked out of, thought being liked meant being safe. What I didn't realize is that approval is unstable currency. It disappears the moment you stop performing. Self-respect, on the other hand, compounds. If I had understood this, I would have chosen discomfort over resentment far more often. Time was my biggest misunderstanding. I acted like I had endless amounts of it while simultaneously panicking that I was running out. One delayed starting things. That mattered because I wanted the perfect moment. I waited for motivation, confidence, and certainty to arrive first. They never did. What I learned much later is that action creates clarity, not the other way around. Starting badly beats waiting perfectly every single time. If I had known this at 25, I would have begun more things afraid and unfinished instead of never starting at all. Money confused me deeply. I believed earning more would finally make me feel secure, respected, and confident. I tied my identity to my income and my job title. When I earned more, I felt valuable. When I earned less, I felt invisible. No one told me that money solves problems, but it does not give meaning. Yes, chasing it without purpose leads to comfort without fulfillment. If I had known this, I would have focused less on impressing others and more on building skills, habits, and discipline that quietly pay off over time. Relationships at 25 felt intense and consuming. I confused attention with love and chemistry with compatibility. I stayed in situations that drained me because I was afraid of being alone. I didn't realize that loneliness inside the wrong relationship hurts far more than solitude ever could. I also didn't understand that how someone treats you is information, not an invitation to fix them. If I had learned this earlier, I would have walked away faster and trusted that peace is not something you negotiate for. Failure terrified me then. Every mistake felt permanent, like one wrong decision could ruin my entire future. That fear kept me small and cautious. What I didn't know is that failure is not the opposite of success, it is part of it. Every person I admired had failed repeatedly before anything worked. The difference was they kept moving while others stopped. Failure only becomes permanent when you let it convince you to quit. If I had known this at 25, I would have taken more risks and fewer excuses. I ignored my health because I thought I could fix it later. I sacrificed sleep, tolerated constant stress, and treated my body like it was indestructible. Later arrives faster than you expect. Energy is not unlimited, and burnout does not ask for permission. If I had known this, I would have protected my physical and mental health as seriously as my goals. The hardest truth I learned too late is that no one is coming to save you. Not in a cruel way, but in a freeing one. Waiting for permission, validation, or rescue keeps you stuck. Responsibility gives you power. The moment you accept that your life is your responsibility, everything changes. At 25, I waited. I waited for confidence, clarity, and certainty. I didn't know those things are built through action, not thought. If I could speak to my 25-year-old self now, I wouldn't give instructions. I would give reassurance. You're not behind. You are learning. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to start over. Most of what you are worried about will not matter, and most of what will matter is already happening quietly. Life is not a race, but it is moving. Pay attention. Choose courage more often than comfort. Protect your time, your energy, and your integrity. The rest figures itself out one imperfect step at a time. There is something else I wish I understood at 25, something that quietly shapes almost every outcome in life. Your environment matters more than your motivation. Back then, I believed discipline was purely internal, that strong people simply push through regardless of circumstances. I blamed myself when I failed to stay consistent, never realizing how much my surroundings were working against me. The people you spend time with, the content you consume, the spaces you live in, all of it programs your behavior. If I had known this earlier, I would have changed my environment before trying to change myself at 25. I stayed around people who normalized complaining, procrastination, and settling. We joked about hating work, being tired all the time, and feeling stuck, without realizing we were reinforcing it. I didn't understand that conversations shape beliefs, and beliefs shape actions. If everyone around you treats mediocrity as normal, excellence starts to feel unrealistic. I wish I had known that you do not need to cut people off dramatically, but you do need to choose who has influence over your thinking. Growth requires exposure to higher standards. I also misunderstood confidence. I thought confident people were fearless, that they somehow lacked doubt. Because I felt doubt constantly, I assumed confidence wasn't for me. What I didn't know is that confidence is built through evidence. Every small promise you keep to yourself becomes proof. Every avoided task weakens trust with yourself. At 25, I broke too many small promises, then wondered why I didn't believe in myself. If I had known this, I would have focused on doing small, comfortable things consistently, instead of waiting to feel ready. Another painful lesson was about overthinking. I spent an enormous amount of mental energy replaying conversations, imagining worst-case scenarios, and planning 10 steps ahead. I thought thinking more would protect me from mistakes. In reality, it just delayed action. Most problems are not solved by thinking harder, but by acting sooner. Clarity rarely comes from sitting still. It comes from feedback. If I had known this at 25, I would have stopped treating my mind like a courtroom and started treating life like a lab. I also believed passion was something you discover, not like a hidden talent waiting to be unlocked. I felt anxious because I didn't have a single burning passion guiding me. What no one explained is that passion is usually built through competence. You grow interested in what you get good at. Mastery creates motivation, not the other way around. If I had known this, I would have committed to learning fewer things more deeply instead of searching endlessly for the perfect calling. Fear played a bigger role in my decisions than I realized. It's fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of regret. Ironically, fear of regret caused me to avoid risks, which created the very regret I was trying to avoid. At 25, I didn't understand that fear never disappears. It only changes shape. It's the difference between people who move forward and those who stay stuck is not bravery, it is willingness. Willingness to feel fear and act anyway. If I had known this earlier, I would have stopped waiting for fear to leave and started moving with it. I also misunderstood progress. I expected dramatic breakthroughs, big moments that would clearly signal I was on the right path in progress. Felt slow or invisible, I assumed I was failing. What I didn't realize is that most progress is boring. It happens quietly, through repetition, long before results appear. At 25, I quit too early because I couldn't see immediate returns. If I had known this, I would have respected consistency more than intensity. Another truth I learned late is that boundaries are not selfish. At 25, I felt guilty saying no. I overextended myself to avoid disappointing others. I didn't realize that every yes costs something, usually time or energy you never get back. People who respect themselves teach others how to treat them. If I had known this earlier, I would have protected my time without apology and understood that resentment is the price of weak boundaries. I also underestimated how quickly life speeds up. Days feel long in your 20s, but years move fast. One routine blends into another until time feels compressed. I thought major change would happen automatically with age. It doesn't. Change requires intention. Without it, you wake up one day wondering how you got here. If I had known this at 25, I would have designed my life more deliberately instead of drifting. Perhaps, the most important realization is that meaning comes from responsibility. It's not from pleasure, not from comfort, but from taking ownership of something that matters. At 25, I avoided responsibility because I associated it with restriction. In reality, responsibility gives structure and purpose. It gives your effort direction. If I had known this earlier, I would have stopped chasing short-term happiness and started building long-term meaning. Looking back, I see that most of my struggles were not caused by lack of intelligence or opportunity, but by misunderstanding how life actually works. No one teaches you these things directly. You learn them through mistakes, often years later. That is why if you are 25 right now, or anywhere close to it, this matters. You don't need to have everything figured out. Just need to start moving with awareness instead of fear. Another thing I wish I understood at 25 is how identity quietly traps you. I labeled myself too early. I told myself stories about who I was and who I wasn't. I'm not confident. I'm not disciplined. I'm not creative. I'm not good with people. Those labels felt like facts, but they were just habits repeated long enough to feel permanent. What I didn't realize is that identity is flexible, especially in your 20s. The story you tell yourself becomes the ceiling you stop pushing against. If I had known this, I would have spoken to myself with more possibility and less judgment. I also believed growth should feel natural.
I understand. Thank you.
I thought if something was right for me, it wouldn't feel so uncomfortable. So whenever something felt hard or awkward, I assumed it wasn't meant for me. That belief cost me years. Growth almost always feels unnatural at first. New behaviors clash with old identities. Discomfort is not a warning sign. It's a signal that change is happening. I had known this at 25. I would have leaned into discomfort instead of backing away from it. Another painful lesson was about validation. I measured my progress based on how others reacted. If people praised me, I felt confident. If they didn't notice, I felt invisible. What I didn't understand is that the most important work often looks unimpressive from the outside. Quiet. Consistency rarely gets applause. At 25, I abandoned things too early because they weren't producing visible rewards. If I had known this, I would have learned to validate myself instead of outsourcing that power to others. I also misunderstood learning. I treated mistakes as proof of incompetence rather than feedback. Every error felt embarrassing, something to hide. In reality, mistakes are data. They show you what doesn't work, so you can adjust. People who grow quickly fail faster, not less.
Thank you.
If I had known this earlier, I would have asked more questions, tried more things, cared far less about looking foolish. Social comparison shaped many of my decisions, measured my behind the scenes against other people's highlights. I didn't see their doubts, their failures, or their support systems. I only saw outcomes. That comparison drained motivation and distorted reality. If I had known this at 25, I would have compared myself only to who I was yesterday, not to someone else's curated image. I also didn't understand how habits quietly shape identity. I focused on goals but ignored systems. I wanted big changes without changing daily behavior. What I learned later is that habits are votes for the type of person you are becoming.
Thank you.
You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. If I had known this, I would have worried less about outcomes and more about daily structure. Another realization came from watching people older than me. The ones who seemed at peace were not necessarily the most successful, but the most aligned. They lived in a way that matched their values. At 25, I didn't even know my values clearly. I borrowed them from family, society, and social media. Without clear values, decisions become exhausting. If I had known this earlier, it would have taken time to define what actually mattered to me, instead of chasing what looked impressive. I also believed that saying yes created opportunities. For a while, it does. But eventually, saying yes to everything creates chaos. At 25, my calendar was full, but my progress was scattered. I didn't understand that focus requires sacrifice, as every meaningful path demands that you ignore many good options. If I'd known this, I would have chosen fewer priorities and pursued them more deeply. Emotional regulation was another blind spot. I thought emotions controlled me, that bad days meant something was wrong. I didn't know that emotions rise and fall regardless of circumstances. Acting based on mood leads to inconsistency. Acting based on commitment leads to results. Had known this earlier, I would have stopped waiting to feel inspired and started showing up regardless of how I felt. One of the hardest lessons was realizing that being busy is not the same as moving forward. I filled my days with activity to avoid facing uncertainty. Motion felt like progress, but much of it was just distraction. If I had known this at 25, I would have asked myself more often whether my actions were meaningful or merely comfortable. Looking back, I see that my 20s were not meant to be about having answers. No. They were meant to be about building capacity. Capacity to handle discomfort, responsibility, uncertainty, and delayed rewards. No one explains this clearly. You learn it by stumbling through it. That's why understanding these things sooner matters. Not because it removes struggle, but because it prevents unnecessary suffering. If you are listening to this and feeling behind, understand this. Feeling behind often means you care. Awareness precedes change. You don't need to overhaul your life overnight. You need to start aligning small actions with who you want to become. That alignment compounds faster than you expect. The last thing I wish I had understood at 25 is how short life feels when you look backward. When you're living it, days feel heavy and slow. When you remember it, years collapse into moments. I thought urgency would come later, that one day I'd wake up naturally motivated to live fully. It doesn't happen like that. Urgency is a choice. Without it, life quietly drifts. If I had known this earlier, I would have treated ordinary days with more attention instead of assuming they were disposable. I also misunderstood happiness. I thought it was something you reach, a destination you arrive at once enough things go right. I kept telling myself I'd be happy when I earned more, figured things out, or felt more confident. What I learned too late is that happiness is not found at the finish line, because there is no finish line. It's a byproduct of living in alignment, of doing hard things you respect yourself for. If I had known this at 25, I would have stopped postponing my happiness and started practicing it through daily choices. Another realization came from regret. I noticed that the regrets people carry are rarely about things they tried and failed at. They're about things they never tried at all, chances they talked themselves out of, words they swallowed, paths they didn't take because they wanted certainty first. At 25, I avoided regret by avoiding risk. Ironically, that created deeper regret later. If I had known this, I would have measured decisions by future regret, not immediate comfort. I also didn't understand how much courage shapes a life. Not dramatic courage, but quiet courage. The courage to be honest, the courage to start before you feel ready, the courage to walk away from what no longer fits. These moments don't look heroic, but they change everything. At 25, I waited for confidence to give me courage. In reality, courage creates confidence. If I had known this, I would have acted sooner and trusted the process to catch up. I wish I understood that no decision keeps all doors open. Trying to keep every option alive eventually closes the most important ones. Commitment feels scary because it removes alternatives, but it also creates momentum. At 25, I stayed undecided too long, afraid of choosing wrong. What I didn't realize is that indecision is also a choice, and it has consequences. If I had known this earlier, I would have chosen direction over perfection.
Thank you.
I also misunderstood self-trust. I thought it was something you either have or don't. In truth, self-trust is built by keeping promises to yourself. Every time you do what you said you would do, even when it's uncomfortable, trust grows. Every time you avoid it, trust weakens. At 25, I broke small promises daily, then wondered why I doubted myself. If I had known this, I would have focused on being reliable to myself above everything else. Another lesson is that most of life is practice. Conversations, careers, relationships, confidence. Nothing is final. You are always allowed to adjust. At 25, I treated decisions like permanent verdicts. That pressure made everything heavier than it needed to be. If I had known this earlier, I would have experimented more and feared mistakes less. I also didn't realize how powerful reflection is. Without reflection, years pass without lessons. With it, even mistakes become assets. Taking time to ask what worked, what didn't, and why accelerates growth. At 25, I kept moving without looking back. If I had known this, I would have paused more often to learn instead of rushing ahead blindly, perhaps. The most freeing realization is that no one is thinking about you as much as you think they are. Fear of judgment kept me quiet and cautious. I didn't realize that people are mostly absorbed in their own concerns. At 25, I limited myself to avoid imagined criticism. If I had known this, I would have lived more boldly and wasted less energy performing. Looking back now, I don't wish for a different life. I wish for earlier understanding, not to eliminate struggle, but to make it meaningful sooner. With awareness builds strength. Struggle without it builds bitterness. If you're 25 or close to it, understand this. You are not supposed to have everything figured out.
Not yet.
You are supposed to be building the skills to figure things out.
It's the only way we grow.
Life rarely changes all at once. It changes when small decisions shift direction. One honest conversation, one habit, one risk, one boundary. Those moments feel small when they happen, but they shape everything that follows. If I had known this at 25, I would have treated small choices with more respect. If there is one thing I would leave you with, it is this. Your future is not decided by what you know, but by what you consistently do. Start where you are. Start imperfectly. Start now. The version of you 10 years from now is watching, hoping you take responsibility today.